The galaxy is a graveyard where faith and fear are ground into dust. Across its endless night, countless voices rise in prayer to the God Emperor, pleading for salvation, begging to be remembered. But there are others, voices that do not cry out to terror, voices that whisper into the void where the Astronomican's light burns thin. They are the lost, the broken, the desperate. They are the ones who find solace not in the throne, but in the shadows that coil beyond it. This is the fate of the Chaos Cultist, a life not measured in victories or honor, but in scars, betrayals, and chains that tighten with every whispered word. To glimpse their existence is to look into the abyss and see it staring back, patient, hungry, eternal. The story you are about to hear is not a tale of triumph. It is a descent into torment without end, a prayer answered by gods who demand only suffering. In the grim darkness of the far future, even stories are battles. Battles for memory, for truth, for the echo of a single human voice before it is swallowed by eternity. If you want more of these chronicles of devotion, betrayal, and damnation, lend your strength here. Subscribe so that the next tale finds you. Share this story with others who wander in search of forbidden knowledge, and leave your thoughts in the comments so that your voice is not lost in the silence. In a universe where forgetting is death, remembrance becomes rebellion. The underlive never sleeps. It wheezes and coughs like a dying organism, pumping foul air through broken vents and dripping rust-flecked water from ceilings that once bore the seal of the Imperium. Somewhere, far above, in spires gilded with the aquila, governors and priests preach about loyalty, sacrifice, and faith in the Emperor. Down here, faith is measured differently. It is measured in how long you can hold on to a loaf of bread before someone stronger takes it. It is measured in how well you hide your child when the press gangs descend to harvest more bodies for the guard. It is measured in how quietly you swallow your despair before it swallows you first. Our story begins with a single man, though he is less than remarkable. He has no title, no bloodline to boast of, no education beyond the scraps learned from discarded data slates. His name is Garen, and his life is as small as the room he sleeps in. To call it a room is generous. It is a collapsed manufactorum shaft, sealed at one end with scrap iron, smelling of promethium spills and mold. He has nothing but the strength of his back, and that strength earns him shifts, hauling slag and broken machine parts in exchange for enough scrip to buy tasteless nutrient paste. His faith in the Emperor is not hatred, nor is it love. It is absence, the kind of hollow reverence you mutter when the Enforcer's shock maul hangs over you. Garen prays not because he believes, but because silence would be noticed. The whispers came to him first in exhaustion. He thought it was the rattle of vents, or perhaps the rumble of tramrails far overhead. But when he listened closely, the sound formed patterns. It spoke not in words at first, but in sensation, warmth brushing his spine. When the hive air was cold, a promise of food when his stomach shriveled with hunger. It is easy to ignore such things once, perhaps even twice, but when the whispers return night after night, curling around your ears like the breath of someone unseen, you begin to wonder whether silence was ever real. Garen tried to smother the voice with drink, tried to bury it beneath the dull ache of labor, but the whispers were patient. They waited when he collapsed into dreamless sleep. They returned when he woke in the black hours before dawn. They called him by name. What makes a man listen? Not glory, not even hope, but the fear that no one else can hear you. The Imperium tells its people they are part of a great machine, that every cog matters. But to Garen, that machine was so vast, he could not see it. He was a grain of sand in the teeth of a colossus, unnoticed, unremembered. The whispers did not see him as a cog. They saw him as Garen, a man who suffered, a man who wanted. For the first time in years, he felt less like a shadow. The cult never approached him in daylight. It began with small signs, a fragment of parchment pressed into his palm when he passed through the market, words scrawled in a language half familiar yet wrong in its angles, a smear of crimson paint on the wall outside his hovel, fresh where no children played, a woman's laugh carried down an alley where no one walked. Each sign was small enough to dismiss. Together, they painted a path. Garen followed because he needed to believe the whispers were not madness. He followed because the Imperium had never once painted a path for him, and these strangers seemed to know he existed. When he finally found them, it was not in a grand hall or cathedral, but in a drainage cistern beneath a collapsed habstack. The cultists were not warriors. They were not hooded sorcerers or frothing zealots. They looked like him, tired men with hollow cheeks, mothers clutching infants that cried for milk, scavengers with missing teeth. At their center was a brazier, its smoke curling like ink through the cracks of the stone ceiling. They sang, not in harmony, but in a ragged unison that sounded like 100 throats struggling to breathe the same air. Garen stood at the edge, feeling his chest tighten. The whispers inside his skull grew louder, pressing against his thoughts. He realized, with sudden dread, that the sound he had heard for weeks was their song echoing through his mind before he ever arrived. A man with scarred lips approached him. His eyes were glazed with fever, yet his voice was steady. "You heard the call," the man said, as though it were undeniable. Garen wanted to deny it, to laugh and turn away, but the words lodged in his throat. The man smiled without warmth. "Then you are already one of us." The ritual was simple. Garen was asked to kneel, and he did. They placed a hand on his head, pressing his face near the brazier until smoke stung his lungs. They asked him not what he had, but what he wanted. He thought of food, of safety, of warmth, but none of those words came out. Instead, he whispered, "To be seen." The crowd moaned, as if those words had weight, as if every soul there had once prayed the same. The scar-lipped man leaned close and told him, "Then they see you now." It was a promise Garen could not understand, yet it filled him with a strange relief. For the first time, his prayer felt answered. He did not yet know that to be seen by the gods of the warp was to be consumed by them, that every desire granted comes wrapped in chains. He only knew that the whispers no longer sounded lonely, they sounded like home. The weeks that followed blurred together, as if the air itself thickened with smoke and memory. Garen worked the same shifts, lifted the same rust-bitten scrap, yet he moved as though tethered to something unseen. The whispers that once crept into his dreams now accompanied him in waking hours, humming beneath the clatter of machinery, echoing between his heartbeats. He would glance at his fellow laborers and wonder if they could hear it too, if perhaps every bowed back and hollow stare was already caught in the same net. But when he hinted, when he let the wordless tune slip past his lips, their eyes narrowed. They heard nothing. It was his alone. The cult was not constant. They did not gather each night, nor did they parade through the hive in open blasphemy. Their rhythm was irregular, pulsing with the secrecy of survival. Sometimes weeks passed without a meeting, and Garen feared the silence more than he once feared the whispers. When the summons finally came, it came as always, subtle, inevitable, a shard of metal inscribed with marks that shimmered faintly, pressed into his hand by a child who vanished into the crowd. The meaning was clear. Tonight, the cistern. By the time he arrived, the brazier burned hotter. The smoke was thicker, crawling along the stones like a living thing. More faces crowded the circle than before, their bodies swaying as though caught by some rhythm deeper than sound. Garen knelt without command, feeling the heat of the fire sting his eyes, and for the first time he joined in their ragged chant. The words did not come from his tongue, but from somewhere beneath it, as though his own flesh had been waiting all along to remember the language. When the chant reached its peak, the scar-lipped man raised his arms. "We are forgotten no longer," he cried, his voice breaking with fervor. "We are seen, we are heard, we are theirs." The crowd roared as though the ceiling might collapse, and Garen felt the sound tear through his chest. Something inside him shifted, subtle but permanent, like a joint pulled from its socket and never reset. He staggered to his feet with the others, sweat soaking his back, and though he could not explain why, he smiled. But after the fervor came the silence. It was in the silence that Garen began to notice things. A woman whose skin seemed too pale, even for the underhive shadows, as if light recoiled from her. A child whose eyes glowed faintly when the brazier dimmed. The scar-lipped man himself, who sometimes blinked out of rhythm, his pupils stretching longer than they should before snapping back into place. He told himself these were tricks of exhaustion, of smoke, and failing vision. Yet he could not shake the sense that they had already surrendered parts of themselves, and in time, so would he. At first, it was small, a warmth in his palms that lingered after chanting, the faint taste of copper when he whispered to himself in the dark. Then came dreams more vivid than life, dreams where endless corridors stretched into the void and doors opened onto visions of fire, teeth, and laughter. In one dream, he saw the Aquila carved into the hive's walls crumble into dust beneath a red tide. In another, he walked among stars, his body aflame yet unconsumed, as voices praised him with words he could not comprehend. He woke from these visions gasping, trembling, yet yearning for them to return. The change did not go unnoticed. His overseer struck him one day for slowing at his post, but Garen barely flinched. The mole cracked his shoulder, but pain dulled quickly, replaced by an odd clarity. He stared at the overseer until the man looked away first. That night, Garen laughed, for no reason he could name. The whispers filled the hollow places where pain should have been. He was becoming something different, though he could not yet name what. What tethered him to the cult was not just belief, but the sense that his life had never truly been his until now. The Imperium had demanded silence, obedience, and anonymity. The cult demanded everything, but in exchange, it gave him something more intoxicating than food or shelter. It gave him meaning, to be seen, to be part of a song older than the Imperium, louder than the endless war. Garen began to wonder if he had ever been alive before the whispers claimed him. And yet, deep beneath this newfound devotion, a seed of unease remained. He saw the way some cultists disappeared between gatherings, their names never spoken again, their faces never returned. He saw how the scar-lipped man's hand trembled when he thought no one was watching, as though even he feared the weight of the bargain they had struck. He wondered if being seen was not a gift, but a sentence. Still, he did not turn away. He could not. For once a man has prayed to the dark, even in ignorance, the dark always answers. The hive above never changed. The tramlines still screamed through rusted channels. The enforcers still prowled the walkways with their shock mauls, and the manufacturer still vomited smoke into skies that would never clear. Yet to Garen, everything seemed altered, as if the world had taken on a second skin. He would catch himself staring at the flicker of lumen strips and seeing shapes hidden in the glow, outlines that moved when no one else was watching. He would hear the pounding of the great furnace hammers and mistake it for the heartbeat of some immense creature buried beneath the hive's foundations. What once was noise now became message, and he could not escape the feeling that all of it was speaking to him, urging him deeper. When the cult summoned him again, it was not to the system. A new path awaited, marked by streaks of dried crimson on the walls, too deliberate to be graffiti. He followed them down stairwells sealed long ago, through tunnels where the air grew heavy with mold and rot, until he reached a chamber that smelled of rust and blood. The brazier was gone, replaced by a pit lined with jagged scrap metal. Around it, the cultists knelt in silence, their foreheads pressed to the stone. Garen joined them, though his chest tightened with unease. The scar-lipped man spoke, but his voice seemed stretched, as if pulled through water. Tonight the veil thins. Tonight the gods glance our way. A shiver passed through the congregation. Garen felt it in his bones, a pressure that pushed inward, as if unseen hands tested the shape of his skull. The pit before them shuddered, and smoke rose not from fire but from nothing, a black mist that writhed like serpents. They were asked, one by one, to step forward and offer something of themselves. A woman cut away her hair and tossed it into the pit, where it vanished before touching the ground. A boy no older than 15 slashed his palm and let the blood drip until he fainted. When Garen's turn came, he hesitated. He had nothing to give, yet the whispers urged him on, filling his ears with promises. Without thinking, he pressed his hand to his chest and spoke aloud what had lived unspoken for years. "Take my fear." The mist recoiled as if struck, then surged upward. For a moment, Garen could not breathe. His heart thundered, but the fear that usually accompanied such terror was gone. He should have trembled, should have wept, yet all he felt was an emptiness where dread had once lived. The cult roared approval, their voices echoing through the cavern like the grinding of machines. Garen staggered back, his vision swimming, but he smiled through the dizziness. He had given away his fear, and in return, he felt weightless. After that night, he was never the same. Danger no longer pressed down on him with the same suffocating weight. When enforcers stormed a work gang and dragged 2 men away for execution, Garen did not flinch. When a collapse buried 3 workers alive, he watched the rubble fall as though it were a performance, curious but untouched. He had traded fear for something sharper, a clarity that stripped the world of hesitation. Yet in its place, new whispers grew, more insistent than before, urging him toward violence. It began small, a shove in the market when another man reached for the same loaf of bread, a cruel smile when a child stumbled and fell in the ash. But the whispers pressed harder, hungrier. They told him that blood meant devotion, that pain meant offering. Soon Garen found himself lingering on the thought of blades, of how easily flesh might part if he pushed just hard enough. He hated himself for it, but even hatred felt thin compared to the thrill that surged when he imagined it. The cult rewarded these changes. He was no longer the newcomer who knelt at the edge of the circle. Now he stood closer to the pit, closer to the scar-lipped man, whose eyes seemed to glimmer with fire no one else could see. They told Garen that the gods had marked him, that his gift was rare. He wanted to deny it, to insist he was still only a man. But the truth pressed against him like the hive's ceiling pressing down. He was changing, and he could not stop it. One night, alone in his hovel, he caught his reflection in a shard of broken glass. His eyes looked back at him, but behind them shimmered something else. A faint glow like the after-image of a dying star. He should have recoiled. Instead, he whispered to the reflection, and the reflection whispered back. The prayer had begun as a whisper. Now it was his only voice. Garen's descent quickened, as though the hive itself conspired to drag him further into the pit he had chosen. His days at the slag fields became meaningless, his muscles working as if pulled by strings, while his thoughts lingered only on the nights below. The overseers shouted, struck, cursed, but none of it mattered. He felt as if he were already walking a second path beneath their gaze, invisible to them, claimed by something they could neither see nor name. When the next summons came, he followed without hesitation. This time, The cult gathering took place in a chamber deeper still, where the walls sweated foul moisture and strange fungi glowed faintly green. The pit remained, but around it sprawled marks burned into the stone, symbols Garen's eyes struggled to follow. They twisted in on themselves, and though his mind recoiled, his heart swelled with recognition. He should not have understood them, yet he did. Fragments of meaning that slid like oil through his thoughts. Devotion, offering, eternity. The scar-lipped man greeted him with a hand pressed to Garen's chest, his touch cold, his smile trembling with something more than joy. "You gave away your fear," he murmured. "Now you will give away your name." The ritual was not spoken but sung, a dissonant chant that clawed at the air like talons. One by one the cultists shouted Garen's name, stripping it of sound until it no longer seemed to belong to him. Then the scar-lipped man asked, "What are you called?" Garen's mouth opened but no word came. His tongue froze, his mind blank, as though the sound itself had been torn away. The congregation erupted in approval. He was nameless now, no longer the man who hauled slag in the hive's bowels. He was a vessel, a voice, a wound waiting to be filled. From that night on, the whispers grew sharper, no longer vague murmurs, but commands clothed in suggestion. They did not speak in sentences, not as humans did, but in sudden impressions. A taste of iron, a flash of crimson, the rhythm of a heart beating too fast. He found himself obeying without thought. Once, the whispers drove him to carve a symbol into a wall where enforcers would see it. Another time, they urged him to follow a man through alleys until that man disappeared into the shadows, never to return. Garen told himself he had not killed, that perhaps the man had fled, but the whispers purred with satisfaction. Sleep no longer brought rest. It brought visions, stars burning out in silence, seas of blood reflecting constellations twisted into alien patterns, figures draped in skin singing hymns of madness. Yet he woke not in terror, but in longing. He wanted those visions again. He wanted to drown in them. He began to wonder if this was the true faith, if the Imperium's sermons of obedience and sacrifice were only a pale imitation of what devotion truly demanded. Still, fragments of the old Garen lingered. When he passed children in the hive, their faces smeared with soot, their hands clutching scraps of food, he remembered his own hunger. Once, a girl's eyes met his, wide and trembling, and for an instant, the whispers faltered. He felt shame then, sharp and piercing, like a nail driven through the heart of his new faith, but it did not last. The cult gathered again, and the song drowned out the memory of the girl's stare. The whispers reminded him pity was weakness, and weakness was death. The scar-lipped man began to speak of war, not the endless war of the Imperium's decrees, but war that belonged to them. War that would tear open the hive itself. Garen felt the words ignite something inside him. The thought of rising from the shadows, no longer hidden but triumphant, filled him with a hunger fiercer than starvation. He saw himself not as a forgotten laborer, but as a weapon, sharpened and aimed. And yet, late at night, when he stared into his broken shard of glass, he wondered what stared back. His eyes glimmered still, faint and unnatural. His face looked older, skin drawn tight, as though stretched by unseen claws. He whispered to the reflection, and sometimes it whispered back in a voice not his own. The man who once bore the name Garen was gone. What remained was something nameless, something carried forward by whispers and shadows. The prayer had consumed the man, and the man had become the prayer. The breaking point came quietly, as though the hive itself wished to keep it secret. Garen, though the name no longer clung to him, was summoned not to a pit or chamber this time, but to a place where the walls bled light. The path wound through shafts, long abandoned, dripping with promethium leaks, where skeletal servitors hung lifeless in alcoves like forgotten icons. The deeper he walked, the louder the song grew in his skull, a pressure so constant he no longer tried to resist. When he reached the chamber, he realized he had arrived at the true heart of the cult. The scarlet man stood at its center, but he was not the same. His robes had sloughed away, his flesh cracked with lines that glowed faintly as though fire lived beneath his skin. His voice, when it came, was no longer strained but resonant, carrying words that made the stone tremble. "The veil thins," he declared, though the crowd did not need telling. The air was thick with presence, with a hunger that coiled like smoke around their limbs. Garen fell to his knees without command, not out of obedience, but out of necessity. Standing was impossible beneath that weight. The ritual that night was not about offerings of hair or blood or names. It was about surrender. One by one, the cultists pressed themselves to the stone floor, arms spread wide, chanting in unison as the scar-lipped man carved symbols into his chest with a jagged blade. The cut spilled not red, but black, the liquid steaming as it touched the ground. Garen watched with a strange calm, his mind detached, as if he were both participant and witness to something far beyond human reckoning. Then the whispers pressed harder, louder, until they became a roar. Garen felt his chest seize, his breath stolen, his vision filled with burning sigils. The pit was no longer a pit. It stretched downward into infinity, a throat of darkness swallowing all light. He saw faces within it, faces of those who had vanished, their eyes hollow, their mouths open in eternal prayer. They were not gone. They had been claimed. Their torment was unending, yet their voices praised in tones that made Garen's bones ache. When his turn came, the scar-lipped man beckoned him forward. The blade was pressed into his hand. The whispers urged him, "Take, give, become." Garen raised the knife, trembling not with fear but with anticipation, and pressed it to his skin. The cut burned like acid, his flesh hissing as though rejecting his own blood. But when it dripped into the abyss, the roar within him softened. It was as though a door had opened, and he had stepped through. The crowd erupted. Hands seized him, pulling him close. Voices chanting his absence of a name, hailing him as something new. He did not know what he had become, only that he was no longer forgotten. His face no longer mattered, nor his past. He was a vessel now, his body an offering, his soul a coin already spent. Yet, in the silence after the chants faded, when the others stumbled away in exhaustion, Garen remained by the pit. He stared into it, his chest heaving, and for the briefest moment he felt clarity. The faces below were not saints. They were not blessed. They were broken, their torment endless. He had joined them willingly, and one day his own reflection would stare back from the abyss, mouth open, voice stolen. Still, when the whispers returned, promising glory, he bowed his head. It was too late to turn back. The prayer had consumed him, and now he was nothing but its echo. The body remembers what the mind tries to forget. Garen's flesh, though the name had been stripped away, the body still bore its scars, aged with the residue of that night's ritual. Each step through the hive tunnels felt weighted, as though his bones had absorbed the black liquid he had spilled into the pit. The wound across his chest no longer bled, but it had not closed either. It pulsed faintly, an ember beneath his skin, whispering in rhythm with his heartbeat. The cult called these marks blessings. To Garen, they felt like shackles he could not remove. His shoulder burned when he lifted his tools in the manufactorum. His hands shook when he tried to steady them. He should have sought the Medicae, but he dared not. To reveal such a wound was to invite questions, and questions in the Imperium rarely ended with answers. So he bore it, hiding beneath ragged cloth, telling himself this was the price of being seen. But soon, the wound became more than pain. It began to change him. He noticed it first in his endurance. The endless shifts that once drained him now passed with unnatural ease. Hunger dulled, exhaustion lifted. He worked harder, faster, his overseer glaring with suspicion, yet unable to deny the output. At night, he returned to the cult, and the scar-lipped man greeted him with satisfaction. "The gods have touched you," he said, eyes glowing faintly in the brazier light. "You are no longer a man, you are a vessel." The vessel learned new rituals. They were not prayers as the Imperium preached, with rote recitations and empty gestures before statues of stone. These rituals cut deeper. Flesh was always the offering, and devotion was measured in scars. The cultists carved the gods' symbols into their arms, backs, and thighs, layering old wounds with new. Garen joined them, though the whispers guided his hand, drawing lines he did not recognize yet instinctively obeyed. The symbols burned long after the blood dried, as though the warp itself had licked the wounds clean. The changes did not go unnoticed among his fellow laborers. Whispers followed him in the manufactorum, mutterings of strange resilience, of eyes that glimmered too brightly beneath the ash. He felt their fear, tasted it in the way they avoided his gaze, and it fed something inside him. Once he had prayed only to be seen. Now he reveled in being feared. The gods had given him more than recognition. They had made him other. But with each gift came a price. The whispers no longer only promised, they demanded. They urged him to strike when insulted, to spill blood when wronged, to carve symbols where the Imperium's Aquila stood. At first he resisted, clinging to scraps of restraint. Yet resistance eroded quickly. One night, cornered by a ganger demanding his scrip, Garen obeyed the voices. The blade he carried sank into the man's throat before he realized he had moved. The blood sprayed warm across his face, and instead of horror, he felt release. The whispers purred with satisfaction, and when he staggered away, he realized the wound across his chest glowed brighter than before. The cult welcomed him as a brother reborn. They did not rebuke the violence, they praised it. The scar-lipped man declared that the gods had accepted his offering, that Garen had proven himself worthy. More scars followed, each layered upon the last, until his flesh resembled not skin, but parchment inscribed with unreadable text. Every line etched into his body felt less like mutilation and more like scripture. He was no longer a man of the hive. He was becoming a page in a story written by powers beyond comprehension. Yet in rare quiet moments, when the chants faded and the brazier burned low, Garen wondered if anything of himself remained. He traced the lines on his chest and arms, unable to distinguish one scar from another, unable to remember which were his choice and which were carved under compulsion. His reflection no longer answered him in silence. Sometimes, in the shard of glass, he saw another face entirely, stretched, twisted, eyes aflame with colors not of this world. It smiled at him, and he found himself smiling back. The flesh remade was not a gift freely given. It was a covenant, binding him ever deeper. His body was no longer his own, and though he felt stronger, faster, more resilient than ever before, he knew the truth. Every scar was a chain. Every chain pulled him closer to the abyss. The brazier fires grew hotter with each gathering, as though the cult's devotion fed not only the unseen gods, but the flames themselves. Garen sat among them, his body trembling, not from fear, but from the pulse of energy that now seemed to flow through his veins. The wound on his chest throbbed in time with the chanting, glowing faintly beneath the ragged cloth he wrapped around it. Others bore scars, twisted and raw, but none burned as his did. The scar-lipped man noticed, and his voice, cracked and heavy, declared Garen chosen. The word carried weight, a crown of fire he could neither reject nor resist. Chosen meant sacrifice. That night, the cult's ritual demanded more than carved flesh or whispered hymns. It demanded blood willingly spilled, not of their own, but of the hive's forgotten. A prisoner had been dragged in, beaten and bound, his mouth gagged with a strip of synth cloth. Garen recognized him, a laborer from the manufactorum, a man who had once worked beside him hauling slag. His eyes, wide with terror, met Garen's across the circle. For an instant, the old Garen stirred, the man who had once prayed to be seen, who had once carried shame in his chest. The whispers drowned that memory. They pressed against his skull, urging, insisting, promising. The blade was placed in his hand, its edge still stained from rituals past. The scar-lipped man spoke with quiet reverence, his voice almost gentle. The flesh must be remade, brother. To give life is to take it. Garen's hand shook, not from fear, but from the tension of resistance crumbling beneath inevitability. The prisoner struggled, gag muffling his cries, and Garen felt the weight of every eye upon him. He drove the blade forward. The sound was wet, final. Blood poured across the stones, hissing as it touched the pit's edges. The whispers roared approval, filling his lungs with a heat that burned from within. The wound on his chest flared, brighter than fire, and for a moment he felt himself dissolve, body and soul both unbound. When he gasped for air, it was not in horror, but in ecstasy. He had crossed a threshold. From then on, Garen no longer hesitated. He became the hand that obeyed the whispers without pause, the blade that never dulled. The cult saw his fervor and lifted him higher, pressing their foreheads to the ground when he passed, calling him voice, vessel, herald. He told himself he was still Garen somewhere deep inside, but the name had long since lost its sound. What remained was a body remade by devotion, a man whose scars had become scripture, whose blood belonged not to himself, but to gods that did not care for men. Yet even in his ascension, doubt lingered. He saw it in the faces of others, those who faltered during the rituals, who trembled when the blade was offered. Some vanished after their weakness, taken by shadows, or consumed by the pit. Others returned broken, their eyes vacant, their bodies barely human. Garen wondered if his strength was faith or simply luck, if the gods marked him for greatness or only spared him because they had not yet finished using him. The flesh remade carried a secret cost. Each scar dulled what remained of his humanity. The warmth of food no longer satisfied. The touch of another's hand no longer comforted. Even fear, the thing he had surrendered so eagerly, had left behind a hollow absence he could not fill. He was more than he had been, and yet somehow less. And deep within, where whispers curled into the marrow of his bones, Garen sensed the truth he dared not speak. Devotion had not freed him, it had claimed him, and his body was no longer his own. The transformation did not stop at scars. Garen's very frame began to betray him, reshaping itself in ways both subtle and grotesque. His shoulders thickened, muscle fiber knitting tighter than a laborer's toil alone could achieve. His skin darkened in patches, as if bruised from within, yet when pressed, it did not yield. There were nights when he woke shivering, his body slick with sweat, only to find faint ridges running down his arms like scales. They faded by morning, but he knew they would return, deeper, more permanent. The whispers called it ascension. He knew it was corruption. The cult embraced these changes with fervor. They gathered around him as though he were proof that the gods' gaze lingered upon their congregation. When he bared the burning wound across his chest, their chants grew frantic, their voices breaking with longing for the same gift. The scar-lipped man anointed him with the blood of fresh sacrifices, smearing crimson symbols onto his brow. The flesh is the canvas of the gods, he intoned, his voice shaking as though drunk on the sight. Through you, they write their will. Garen wanted to deny it, to scream that he was no prophet, but the voices inside his skull howled louder, drowning even his own thoughts. Sleep offered no refuge. In dreams, Garen walked corridors of bone, walls slick with veins that pulsed like living things. Doors opened into chambers where his own reflection awaited him, yet never the same. One night, he saw himself eyeless, chanting with a mouth split too wide. Another night, he stood before his reflection cloaked in robes of flayed skin, the symbols etched across his chest, glowing like molten metal. He would wake gasping, clutching his scars, only to find the faint afterglow still burning beneath his skin. The hive noticed as well. Whispers spread through the manufactorum of the man who no longer tired, who shrugged off blows that would cripple others, whose eyes gleamed in the furnace light like coals. Children turned away from him in fear, and the overseers muttered about reporting him to the enforcers. Garen no longer cared. The cult was his refuge now, the only place where his grotesque changes were celebrated instead of feared. But devotion demanded escalation. One night, the scar-lipped man led the congregation deeper still, into chambers that stank of oil and old blood. There, on a slab of stone, lay a prisoner gagged and bound, his body trembling with terror. Garen was called forward. This time, he was not given a blade. Instead, they demanded his hands alone. The whispers urged him, screaming their hunger into his skull. He hesitated only a moment before obeying. Flesh tore beneath his grip, bones cracked, blood spilled across his scars. He did not stop until the whispers fell silent, purring with satisfaction. When it was over, Garen's hands shook, but not with revulsion. They shook with exhilaration. His chest, wound, glowed brighter than ever before, casting faint red light against the stone. The congregation roared, voices breaking, their devotion reaching fever pitch. The scar-lipped man declared Garen more than chosen now. He was marked, a living hymn, the flesh remade by devotion. And yet, when he washed the blood from his hands in a cistern days later, he saw his reflection ripple unnaturally in the water. His face was still his, but behind it flickered another visage, distorted, grinning, waiting. He realized with sudden clarity that his body was no longer his to command. Every scar, every change, every act of violence had carved away at his humanity, leaving only space for the gods to write their will. He was becoming less Garen with each passing day, and more, something else, something that would not stop until he no longer existed at all. The air in the hive seemed to thrum whenever Garen walked through it, as though unseen currents recognized what he had become. He felt it in the way doors creaked open without his touch, in the way vermin scattered at his presence, in the way even hardened gangers lowered their eyes when he passed. His scars pulsed with each step, alive beneath his skin, reminding him that he was no longer one of them. He was set apart, remade, and though the cult called it blessing, Garen began to feel the curse behind the gift. It became undeniable when the seizures began. They struck without warning, violent convulsions that dropped him to his knees in the manufactorum, foam frothing at his lips while overseers shouted and cursed. Yet he did not die. Each time the fit ended as abruptly as it began, leaving him stronger, clearer, his vision sharpened to impossible detail. He could see the sweat on a man's brow from across the chamber, could hear the hum of energy flowing through conduits buried in the walls. But he could also hear the voices more clearly now, no longer whispers but a chorus clawing at the edges of his sanity. At the next gathering, the cult received him with awe. They claimed his seizures were revelations, the god's fire burning through his body, searing away the last remnants of weakness. The scar-lipped man ordered Garen stripped to the waist, his chest and arms laid bare. There, before the congregation, they pressed hot irons into his skin, branding fresh symbols atop old scars. He did not scream. The pain was unbearable, but it was also transcendent, each sear burning away the man he had been. When the ritual ended, the cult fell to their knees, chanting until their throats bled. Garen stood trembling, his flesh scorched and cracked, and for the first time he realized he could no longer recall his mother's face, nor the sound of his own name when spoken with kindness. Days bled into nights without distinction. He ate little, yet his body did not wither. He slept less, yet exhaustion never came. Instead, he drifted through the hive like a revenant, both feared and revered. He found himself drawn to places of ruin, collapsed hablocks, shattered shrines, forgotten tunnels. There he would kneel without command, pressing his scorched palms to the ground until visions poured into him. Cities burning beneath crimson skies, rivers running thick with corpses, titans striding like gods of iron across fields of ash. These were not dreams, they were promises etched into his mind, as clearly as scars into flesh. But promises, he realized, carried a cost. Each vision left him hollow, stripped of memory, as if pieces of himself were consumed to make room for what the gods revealed. He could no longer recall the laughter of his fellow laborers. He struggled to remember the feel of his own voice, when it was truly his, not guided by the chorus inside him. He was becoming an empty vessel, filled only with what the warp desired. And still, the cult exalted him. They daubed their brows with his blood, called him herald, begged him to intercede with the gods on their behalf. He wanted to tell them the truth, that there was no mercy in what he carried, only torment. But when he opened his mouth, only the god's voice came forth. It echoed through the chamber, rattling stone, filling the air with a resonance not human. The congregation wept with joy, not realizing the man they once knew had already been devoured. The flesh had been remade, but not into something divine. It had been twisted into a cage, a living scripture of agony and devotion. Garen understood, then, with a clarity sharper than any blade, that he was no longer merely serving the gods. He was trapped within them, a soul screaming behind the mask of a prophet. And in that scream, he knew his torment was only beginning. The hive had always been a place of violence, but now the violence carried purpose. Garen's transformation was complete enough that the cult no longer kept him in the shadows. They armed him. The blade placed in his hand was no longer ritualistic, but practical, forged from scrap, yet honed to a cruel edge. The scar-lipped man announced that the gods demanded more than whispered prayers and blood spilled in basements. They demanded war. It began small, with ambushes in forgotten alleys. Enforcers found their patrols cut apart, their bodies marked with sigils painted in their own blood. Garen led many of these strikes, his scars glowing faintly beneath the grime of battle. The first time he drove his blade through an armored chest, the whispers shrieked with joy so loud he nearly fell to his knees. Yet he did not stop. Every death was an offering, every cry a hymn. The cult followed him with fanatical fervor, their chants echoing through the hive's corridors long after the last shot was fired. The Imperium did not ignore this rebellion. The Arbites came, their carapace armor gleaming, their shotguns roaring with the authority of the throne. Garen should have feared them, but fear was a memory his body no longer carried. He waded into their lines like a storm, blade carving arcs of red across their visors. Their shotguns tore holes in his flesh, but each wound only drove him further into frenzy, his blood steaming as if the gods themselves kept him alive. When the last Arbite fell, Garen stood drenched in gore, his body trembling with ecstasy. The cult fell to their knees, hailing him as herald of war. But with war came chains. The whispers no longer guided softly, they commanded. Garin found himself unable to act without their urging, his limbs sluggish unless driven by their hunger. He realized with dread that his victories were not his own. He was a puppet, strings pulled by hands that dwelled far beyond reality. The chains tightened each time he killed, each time he carved symbols into the walls, each time he bellowed prayers he no longer believed yet could not silence. The Astra Militarum arrived next, their boots pounding through the hive streets, lasguns cracking like thunder. Garin led his cultists against them, though he knew the outcome was hopeless. Guardsmen died in droves, but for every one that fell, 2 more appeared, their discipline unshaken by the chaos around them. Garin's blade sang, his scars burned, but the weight of chains dragged heavy on his soul. He saw his brothers and sisters fall beside him, torn apart by disciplined volleys, their bodies left smoking on the ground. Still the whispers demanded more, still the gods hungered. It was then Garin understood the true torment of devotion. Chaos had promised freedom, but there was no freedom in this war. Only chains heavier than the Imperium's, forged of flesh and blood and bound tight around his soul. Every strike he made in battle was not his own, but the will of beings who would never bleed for him, never mourn him, never even remember his name. And yet, he fought on, not because he wished to, but because he could not stop. The fire of battle consumed him, and the chains of devotion dragged him deeper into damnation. The streets of the hive became rivers of ash and blood. Garin marched at the head of the cult. Though he no longer felt like a leader, he was an instrument, driven forward by voices that never ceased, even in the rare silences between volleys of last fire. The Astra Militarum pressed hard, their formations disciplined, their vox units barking orders with mechanical precision. Yet against them surged the ragged tide of the cult, clothed in rags and scars, armed with blades, stolen las pistols, and the frenzy of desperation. Garin's presence alone seemed to hold them together. When his scarred chest burned with crimson light, they believed themselves invincible. The first true battle was fought in the ruins of a manufactorum, once dedicated to promethium refining. The air was thick with fumes, flames leaping from shattered pipelines. Garin carved his way through the firestorm, his blade an extension of the whispers that screamed for slaughter. Guardsmen fell beneath him, their armor cleaved, their faces burned away in the inferno. He should have felt triumph. Instead, he felt only the tightening of chains. Each kill left him emptier, his body moving faster, stronger, yet his mind slipping further from its own grasp. The cultists around him howled their devotion, tearing into soldiers with bare hands, biting, clawing, painting symbols on the walls in blood that steamed as it dried. Garin glimpsed one woman cradling a severed head, croning to it as if it were her child. Another man laughed as he burned alive, chanting hymns until his throat melted. These were no longer mortals but fragments of madness, shattered reflections of what he was becoming. He realized then that chaos did not lift men higher. It ground them into pieces, scattering them until nothing human remained. Still, the Astra Militarum pushed forward, las fire cutting down dozens, grenades blasting apart entire clusters of cultists. Garin waded through it all, his scars glowing brighter with every wound he suffered. At one point, a bayonet pierced his abdomen, yet he did not fall. He pulled the guardsman close, whispering the god's words into his ear as he drove his blade upward, feeling the life leave the man's body. When Garin pulled free, the bayonet remained lodged in his gut, but the wound closed around it, flesh knitting with unnatural resilience. The whispers howled their approval. The chains grew tighter still. By the battle's end, the manufactorum was nothing but ruin. Hundreds lay dead, both guardsmen and cultists, their bodies mingling in grotesque heaps. Garin stood at the center of it, chest heaving, blood dripping from every scar. His followers fell to their knees around him, praising him as chosen, as prophet, as living vessel. He wanted to scream at them that he was nothing but a puppet, that every victory was stolen from him by gods who cared nothing for his soul. But when he opened his mouth, only their words came out, booming across the chamber with inhuman resonance. The cultists wept and bowed deeper, hearing prophecy where there was only torment. In the silence that followed, Garen realized he had crossed a threshold that could not be undone. He was no longer a man leading a rebellion. He was a weapon wielded by hands unseen, a herald bound by chains stronger than any iron. The fire of battle had not freed him. It had consumed him, leaving only the hollow shell of a man filled with the voices of eternity. And as the smoke cleared, and the distant thunder of approaching armor shook the ground, Garen knew the gods were not done. They would never be done. His torment had only begun to burn. The days that followed bled into one another, war and worship, no longer distinct. Garen led raids through the Underhive like a hound loosed from its leash, the cult at his back howling like beasts. Manufacturer were gutted, Arbite's precincts overrun, shrines to the Emperor desecrated with blood and sigils that twisted even as they dried. Every victory should have been a triumph, yet Garen felt nothing but the weight of chains tightening around his spirit. In the heat of battle, his body moved with terrifying grace. Bullets tore through him, only to seal moments later, his scars burning so brightly they lit the tunnels around him. His blade struck with impossible precision, each motion guided by the chorus that screamed within his skull. He should have felt powerful. Instead, he felt hollow, an echo chamber where only the gods' voices could be heard. When he looked into the eyes of his enemies as they fell, he sometimes thought he saw pity there, as if they understood he was less their killer and more their fellow victim. The Astra Militarum answered with fury. Whole platoons descended into the hive, supported by chimeras and heavy weapon teams. Garen's cult fought like rabid animals, heedless of losses, their devotion insulating them from fear. But devotion was no armor against lasguns, autocannons, or the merciless tide of Imperial discipline. His followers fell in droves, their bodies littering the corridors. Still, they screamed his name. What fragments of it remained, as if their deaths were an extension of his will. Garen wanted to tell them it was not his will, that he was no prophet, but the chains silenced him. Only the god's hunger could pass his lips. In one battle, amid the ruins of a collapsed hab block, Garen came face to face with a commissar. The man's greatcoat was torn, his chainsword caked with gore, but his eyes blazed with unshakable faith.
"You are nothing,"
the commissar spat, "a slave to your own corruption." For a moment the words cut through the whispers. Garen's hand faltered, his blade hovering. Could it be true? Was he nothing more than a slave? The chains wrenched tighter. His arm moved without his will, the blade plunging deep. The commissar gasped, blood frothing his lips. Yet even as he fell, his gaze held steady, filled with a pity that Garen could not bear. That night, Garen dreamed of chains, endless chains stretching across the stars, each link forged from the souls of the damned. He saw himself among them, bound and dragged toward a pit of fire without end. When he woke, the scars on his chest blazed so hot the skin around them cracked and bled. The cult saw it as a miracle, falling prostrate before him, but Garen knew the truth. He was not leading them. He was being dragged alongside them into torment none of them could comprehend. And still, the wars raged on. For every guardsman he cut down, for every shrine he defiled, the chains pulled tighter, binding him ever closer to the abyss. The fire of battle did not free him. It forged his prison, link by burning link, until he could scarcely remember what it felt like to be a man at all. The hive was collapsing into open war. No longer was the cult a whispering cancer in forgotten tunnels. It had become a wound tearing straight through the Imperium's order. Garen marched at its center, no longer hiding his glowing scars, no longer pretending to be human. Each battle left the streets soaked in blood and the air choked with ash, but the voices within him only clamored for more. The Astra Militarum escalated, bringing tanks rumbling through avenues once meant for hab-block traffic, their heavy bolters stitching death across the stone. Garen led his followers straight into the storm, each step driven not by courage but by compulsion. The cultists screamed their devotions as they were torn apart, bodies disintegrated into red mist under disciplined fire. Garen alone pushed forward, every wound that should have felled him burning shut with unnatural resilience. The whispers exalted him, promising eternal glory, but with every kill he felt the last fragments of his soul crumble. It was in the shadow of a broken manufactorum spire that Garen truly saw what he had become. The battle had raged for hours, guardsmen clashing against his dwindling followers in waves of steel and fire. Smoke coiled around him, glass fire seared his flesh, and still he fought. But when the last cultist fell at his side, their chants cut short in a gurgling scream. Garen looked down and saw only chains, not of iron, but of flesh and scar, winding up his arms, his chest, his throat. He staggered, the world tilting, and for a moment he thought the gods themselves had bound him visibly. But when he blinked, the chains were gone, only the weight remained. Across the battlefield, the guardsmen advanced, step by step, their rifles steady, their discipline unbroken. Garen could have turned and fled into the tunnels, could have vanished into shadow. Instead, he raised his blade once more, not out of choice, out of compulsion. His body was no longer his. The whispers screamed through him, filling his lungs, driving his limbs. He waded into their fire, each strike of his blade a hymn he could not stop singing. By the time the battle ended, the manufactorum was nothing but a ruin, the ground slick with bodies. Garen stood alone among the corpses, his chest glowing faintly, his blade trembling in his hands. He had won nothing, he had lost everything. The fire of battle had not broken his chains, it had forged them, link by link, until he realized he was bound more tightly than ever before. And somewhere, far above the hive's choking smog, he thought he heard laughter echoing through the warp. The cult was broken, though they still called it victory. Garen's followers had been slaughtered in their hundreds, their bodies piled in silent heaps across the underhive. Yet those who remained pressed their brows to the ground before him, whispering his name. What fragments of it still clung to memory, as if he were the one who had saved them. Garen knew better. He had saved no one. He had led them into the fire, and the fire had consumed them all. But the scar-lipped man still lived. Somehow, amid the carnage he had endured, his gaze sharper, his voice heavier with conviction. "The gods have tested us," he said, standing on the mound of corpses, as though it were an altar, "and we have not failed. We are remade in blood. We are remade in chains." The cult howled agreement, but Garen only felt hollow. The whispers no longer promised freedom or glory. They pressed against him like bars, hemming him in, forcing his breath to come in shallow, desperate gasps. Betrayal came not in the form of a knife, but in the revelation that he was never meant to lead. The scar-lipped man began to speak as if Garen were merely a herald, a vessel, a tool to carve the way for his own ascension. Rituals that once placed Garen at the center now placed the scar-lipped man upon the dais, his body draped in stolen finery, his skin carved with new, deeper wounds that glowed with the same faint fire Garen once believed unique to himself. Garen realized with cold clarity that he had never been chosen. He had been used, a candle lit to burn quickly, its light guiding another toward the throne. The illusion of power shattered in that moment. Garen saw how the gods played with them all, pitting zealot against zealot, promising each that they were special, when in truth, none were anything but fuel. The whispers that had once exalted him now laughed, mocking his struggle, urging him to strike down his rival, not for freedom, but for the sheer spectacle of it. Rage boiled inside him, not the rage of devotion, but the rage of a man who realized too late that his soul had been bartered for a lie. And yet, even in rage, he was bound. The chains around him pulled tight, every thought of rebellion twisted into compulsion. He could not defy the scar-lipped man, nor the gods that hissed through his blood. He was trapped, forced to kneel as the congregation raised another prophet, another puppet, while his own scars burned with jealous hunger. It was then Garen understood the cruelest truth. Betrayal was not an accident, not a failure of faith. Betrayal was the very structure of chaos itself. Every promise dangled like bait, every vision of power nothing but a leash. The cultists tore each other apart, not because they failed, but because that was the gods' desire. Betrayal was the hymn they all sang, the inevitable end of every oath, every brotherhood, every bond. Garen clenched his fists until blood ran down his arms, the whispers purring in satisfaction. He was theirs, body and soul, and his torment was only deepening. The ceremonies grew more elaborate, as though the scar-lipped man sought to prove to the gods that he alone was worthy of their gaze. Where once the brazier and pit had been enough, now entire chambers were drenched in blood, walls painted with sprawling runes that shifted when no one looked directly at them. Garen stood among the congregation, but no longer at its center. He had become a shadow, a relic, revered but sidelined, his body aching as the scars across his chest pulsed with a resentment that was not entirely his own. The whispers that once exalted him now jeered. They filled his skull with mocking laughter, reminding him that his rise had never been his choice, nor his downfall his failure. He had been carried on a tide, not of faith, but of manipulation, lifted high only to be cast down for the amusement of unseen gods. At night, when he closed his eyes, he saw chains coiled around him tighter than ever, their links forged not only from his devotion, but from his envy, his helplessness, his rage. The scar-lipped man began to call himself vessel, herald, even prophet. His body twisted under the strain of these claims, flesh splitting, bones protruding in unnatural ways. The cult saw divinity in his deformities, but Garen saw only the same fate that awaited them all, to be torn apart, piece by piece, until nothing remained. And yet, he could not speak against it. Each time he tried, the chains pulled his tongue into silence. When he attempted to step forward, his limbs betrayed him, locking into stillness. He was a prisoner within his own skin, forced to watch the lies unfold. The illusion of power, once so intoxicating, now tasted like ash in his mouth. He recalled the moment he had given away his fear, the moment he had surrendered his name, the moment he had been hailed as chosen. Each memory felt like a dagger turned inward, each scar like a tally of his submission. The cult still bowed to him at times, still traced his wounds with trembling fingers as though they were holy, but it meant nothing. He knew what they could not admit. They were pawns in a game they could never win. One night, as the congregation howled their devotions, Garen felt the chains shift. For the briefest instant, they loosened, just enough for a thought to pierce the fog. It came not from defiance, but from despair. If betrayal was the very fabric of chaos, then perhaps his final act should be to betray as well, to betray the cult, the scar-lipped man, the gods themselves. The thought flickered like a dying lumen, fragile and fleeting, yet it was his alone. The whispers recoiled, hissing with anger. His chest burned as though the wound would split open and spill his entrails onto the stone. Yet Garen clung to the thought, trembling with the effort of holding it. For the first time in what felt like eternity, he tasted something like freedom, not in action, but in defiance held silent within his own mind. He knew it was fragile. He knew the chains would tighten again, but in that single moment, surrounded by madness and deceit, he realized that even in torment, the smallest act of rebellion was still possible. And that thought, however fleeting, terrified the gods. The scar-lipped man's ascension continued like a wound that refused to close. Each gathering left him more monstrous, his limbs lengthening, his spine arching as though some unseen hand was stretching him into a shape no mortal body was meant to endure. The cult adored it, their chants rising louder with every new deformity. Garen watched in silence, the embers of rebellion smoldering in his chest. He wanted to laugh at their blindness, to shout that what they worshipped was not divinity but ruin. Yet the chains coiled ever tighter, forcing him to kneel with the others, his voice joining in chants he no longer believed. Still, the seed of betrayal grew. He began to notice the cracks in the scar-lipped man's dominion. Devotees whispered among themselves, not of Garen's glory, but of unease at the prophet's grotesque form. Some trembled when his voice broke into tones too deep, too resonant, echoing with a power that shook stone. Others averted their eyes from the symbols etched into his flesh, runes that writhed like worms beneath the skin. They adored him because they feared him, and fear, Garen remembered, was brittle. The gods saw his doubt. They punished him with visions sharper than any blade. He dreamed of the eye of terror opening wide, its maw swallowing the stars. He saw himself stretched across its surface, his skin flayed into banners, his scars glowing as sigils of endless torment. He woke screaming, blood dripping from the wounds that had split anew during his sleep. The cult took it as a sign, gathering around him in awe, but Garen knew the truth. It was not a gift, it was a warning. And yet, the visions only hardened his resolve. He began to look at the cult, not as brothers and sisters, but as tools. Their devotion could be turned, their fear redirected. If betrayal was the law of chaos, then he would wield it. Quietly, secretly, he whispered doubts into eager ears, twisting their faith against the scar-lipped man. He spoke not of freedom, such words would mean nothing, but of strength, of power, of the God's will being misinterpreted by a prophet too consumed by his own hunger. His words spread like sparks in dry tinder, small at first, then catching, then smoldering into flame. The scar-lipped man noticed. His gaze lingered on Garen longer than before, suspicion etched into every line of his twisted face. Once, in the middle of a ritual, his voice faltered, his chant breaking as his eyes locked with Garen's. For a moment, silence rippled through the cult, unease spreading like poison. Garen felt the chains tugging at him, commanding submission, but he held the man's stare, and for the first time did not look away. The illusion of power was cracking. The gods laughed, amused at their pawns tearing each other apart, but Garen no longer cared. He would endure their laughter. He would even endure their wrath. If he was to be damned, then he would not be damned as a puppet dancing to another man's song. He would damn himself on his own terms, through betrayal as sharp and sudden as the blade he once drove into the heart of an innocent. In the end, it was not salvation he sought. It was simply the right to fall by his own hand, not theirs. The turning point came in a chamber drenched with smoke and blood. The scar-lipped man stood upon the dais, his body a grotesque monument of devotion, flesh splitting to reveal glimpses of something molten beneath. The cult howled his name as though it were a hymn, their voices rising until the very stone seemed to tremble. Garen knelt among them, his scars burning, the chains tugging at his every nerve. Yet within his chest, the ember of defiance glowed hotter than the brazier's flames. The ritual was meant to mark the prophet's final ascension. Offerings were dragged forward, prisoners from the manufactura, their eyes wide with terror, their mouths gagged to stifle their screams. The scar-lipped man raised his arms, calling upon the gods to consume the flesh of the weak and remake him as their chosen vessel. His voice split into two tones, one human, one inhuman, both shrieking in discordant harmony. The congregation prostrated themselves in awe. Garen watched, and in the flickering light, he saw not ascension, but rot. The gods pressed against him, urging his submission, filling his mind with images of eternal torment should he resist. He felt their laughter, their scorn, their hunger, but beneath it all, he clung to the single thought he had nurtured in secret. Betrayal was inevitable, and it could be his weapon. If chaos demanded treachery, then he would give it, but not in the way they expected. When the scar-lipped man descended from the dais to take the knife, Garen rose. The cult gasped, their chants faltering, the air thick with sudden silence. His scars burned so fiercely they split open, blood and light spilling down his chest. The prophet froze, his molten gaze narrowing. For an instant, Garen thought the chains would break him, that he would collapse under their weight, but instead, they cracked, just enough. He moved, faster than thought, faster than devotion, faster than fear. His hand seized the blade meant for sacrifice, and with a roar torn from the pit of his soul, he drove it into the scar-lipped man's chest. The prophet screamed, a sound that split the air like rending metal, his body convulsing as blood and fire poured from the wound. The cult shrieked in horror and ecstasy, their voices rising in chaos as the dais shook beneath their feet. Garen held the blade firm, pressing his face close to the prophet's. "You are no vessel," he whispered, his voice raw, his chains rattling with every word. "You are nothing, and so am I." With a final thrust, he ripped the blade free. The scar-lipped man collapsed, his body spasming, his molten light flickering into darkness. The congregation wailed, some fleeing, others clawing at their own flesh in madness. The whispers roared in Garen's mind, furious, mocking, promising torment beyond measure. Yet for the first time, he did not feel hollow. For the first time, his act was his own. The illusion of power shattered completely, leaving only blood, silence, and the knowledge that his betrayal had been his alone. Garen stood amid the chaos, the chains still heavy, the whispers still screaming, but in that single act, he had torn one link apart. The prophet's body lay twitching in the shadows of the brazier, his molten eyes dimming, his once commanding voice reduced to wet gasps that soon fell silent. The cult had scattered into frenzy, some weeping, others clawing at each other, still others chanting Garen's name with desperate fervor, as though desperate to shift their devotion to a new master. Garen stood over the corpse, his blade dripping, his chest heaving as blood and light poured from the split scars across his body. For the briefest heartbeat, he believed he had won something, perhaps not freedom, but at least the dignity of betrayal chosen with his own hand. But the whispers did not fade. They grew louder, more venomous, their laughter filling every crevice of his skull. He staggered, pressing bloodied hands to his ears, but the sound came from within, not without. Chains coiled tighter, crueler, binding not his limbs but his soul. He realized then that the gods had not cared who stood on the dais, who led the cult, who bled the most, or screamed the loudest. They only cared for the torment. Betrayal had not broken the cycle, it had fed it. The cult returned to him, crawling across the stone on hands and knees, their eyes wide with terror and hope. They begged him to lead, to speak with the god's voice, to continue the hymn of madness the scar-lipped man had left unfinished. Garen opened his mouth to deny them, to scream that he was no prophet, that he was no savior. Instead, the gods spoke through him, his throat vibrating with tones not human. The congregation howled in delight, convinced their faith had only deepened. Garen felt his own voice buried deeper still, smothered beneath words he did not choose. The torment became endless. In battle, his body fought without pause, wounds closing as quickly as they opened, his blade striking with precision not his own. In the silence between battles, visions clawed at him, visions of his body stretched across altars, of his face carved into stone idols, of his soul gnawed upon by daemons for eternity. He could not sleep, for the warp invaded every dream. He could not wake, for waking was only another form of nightmare. He walked the hive like a revenant, the cult trailing behind him in endless devotion. To them he was chosen, a prophet crowned in blood and scars. To himself, he was a hollow husk, a man who had given away his fear, his name, his humanity, and finally even his rebellion. The chains rattled within him, and he knew they would never break. In time, Imperial retribution descended in full. Adeptus Arbites, inquisitorial agents, perhaps even whispers of the Astartes, all marched into the hive, determined to purge the corruption. Garen stood at the head of his dwindling cult, blade in hand, scars burning bright enough to light the tunnels. He knew what awaited: death, annihilation, perhaps even worse. And yet, the gods would not allow him to falter. They drove him forward into the fire, into the slaughter, his soul chained to their hunger. And so Garen's torment stretched on, unending, eternal. Whether his body fell in battle or his soul was dragged screaming into the warp, it mattered little. Once seen by the gods, there was no escape, no redemption, no end. His prayer had been answered, and the answer was chains. The endless torment of a chaos cultist is not a fate one chooses. It is a fate that devours, that consumes, that binds a soul to eternity's hunger. Garen had sought only to be seen. Now he was forever, and the gaze that fell upon him would never let him go.